labor market, right? So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what labor market is and what we'll talk about, what are all the questions or all the topics that we'll talk about in labor market, right? So labor market, just like any other market, uh, is about the demand and supply, right? So, but this is different from the product market. So up till now, we have talked about the product markets. What is a product? Product we know is any good or service that consumers wish to buy because it provides them some utility, some satisfaction, and against that, they are willing to pay some price to the producers, right? So that was a product market. But when we talk about factors of production market, so just like there are product markets where you buy goods and services like food, shoes, clothes, laptops, cell phones, right? And so on. Similarly, you have factors of production market, right? So factors of production, we know there are 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So out of those 4, we will only be discussing labor market as this is part of our syllabus. So these are known as factors of production markets, right? So labor market is one of these markets, right? Okay, now this being said, now what we'll talk about in the labor market. Labor is, as per the definition, we know labor is any human effort, whether mental or physical, provided by human beings to any business, and against that effort, they get some compensation, which is known as wage, salary, whatever you want to call it, right? Okay, now in labor market, the question that we will address, how are wages determined, right? So first question, that is the most important one, how are wages determined? So how or who gets to decide that a certain type of labor, right? So let's say a doctor, or let's say an engineer, or let's say someone else will earn how much. There has to be a mechanism. There needs to be a mechanism, right? So how in economics, or basically how wages of a country are determined in different sectors, like in different professions. So that is the first topic that we'll discuss within labor market. Then we'll talk about some other related topics like why is there wage differential? So wage differential basically means that why some people earn so much, why some people earn so little, why is there wage differential, right? So this is kind of linked to the first one, right? So that's another subtopic that we'll discuss. Then another thing that we'll talk about is that how government intervenes in labor market, right, to achieve a more equitable outcome. How and why. So why and how governments intervene in labor markets. We'll talk about all the policies that government makes around labor market, which includes minimum wage legislation and a couple of other things that you must have heard. Why and how government intervenes in labor market, right? Is this simple? Okay, now let's get started on this. So the first question, how are wages determined? Now, the first thing that you need to know, just like any other market, you have labor demand and labor supply, right? So just like any other product market where the price of a product is set through the market forces of demand and supply, similarly in the labor market as well, the wages will be determined through market demand and market supply, right? So we are about to discuss wage determination, right? Sorry, wage determination, right? Okay, now in this, I just said that wages are determined on the basis of market force of demand and supply, right? Now, what is labor demand and what is labor supply? That is what we will look at in detail. Wages, any occupation, are based on demand and supply of labor, right? So that's the first thing that we need to know. Demand and supply of labor. Okay, now let's deep dive into what is demand and what is supply of labor. Okay, Right. Because that way it's faster or what? We can, oh, because that way you will have the notes available. Okay. Yeah, we can do that. We can do that. Not a problem. Right. Right. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. I get it. I get it. Yeah. So let's do that. Okay. Now let's make a new topic for new, where are the class notes? Let me close all these extra tabs. Okay. Now the live, there we go. We close this one, this, and then we have class notes, and we have, sorry, labor market, right? Okay. Now let's quickly do a quick recap and then take it forward from there. Just like product markets, where goods and services are reduced and demanded, are production markets where different FOPs are supplied, demanded, right? So this is something that we have already discussed. Now, next thing, the next thing that we started our discussion about was what is wage determination, right? So wage determination is the process how wages are determined in a free market, right? So first of all, we'll think that there's a free market, right, where there's no government intervention and stuff like that, which we most of the times assume in economics. So first of all, we'll talk about how wages are determined in the free market, right? So again, also based on the demand and supply of labor, right? Now, this being said, what's the fundamental thing over here? Just like product prices are based on the demand supply of those goods, right? Similarly, wages, which is basically the compensation for labor, right? So what are wages? Wages are the compensation for labor services, right? So if I work full time in a school or if I work somewhere in an office, I'm providing them some labor services. Against that, the compensation that they provide me, who will determine how much that compensation will be? So that's purely based on how much is the demand and how much is the supply for labor for that particular occupation, for that particular task, right? Now, this being said, now the next thing that we have to discuss is what is labor demand, right? So what is labor demand? Okay. Now, first thing, who demands labor? Preet? Who demands labor in an economy? And I mean, that is very obvious why they demand labor, but the part that who demands labor. So what do you think? Who demands labor? Right? So they exactly. So labor is demanded by the companies, the producers who are producing any product, right? So simplest example of this would be that you can't operate a hospital without doctors, right? Similarly, a school can't operate without teachers, right? And stuff like that. So that's very obvious. And who supplies labor, right? So what do you think? Who supplies labor, right? So we are looking at labor market and we have the labor itself. Excellent, excellent, absolutely correct, right? Now think about this. So on the demand side, it is the company who want to hire people to run their operations, to run their companies and to provide the goods that they want to for their consumers. And on the supply side, who is supplying labor? The people, the individuals who are willing to work, right? Because obviously they'll get a compensation for that. And again, with that compensation, they can buy their own goods and services that they need, right? So that's the cycle, how it works, right? So companies, corporations who want to produce any product, they are the ones demanding that labor service. And on the supply side, it is the individuals themselves, people who are willing to work. Okay, now this being said, we'll move forward. Okay, now on the demand, we have to understand that how much a company would be willing to demand. Now that's very important. Or labor agencies. Yeah, that's correct. But even, with labor agencies, basically they're just a additional step. So labor agencies are basically doing the same thing, that they're connecting the firms with the labor. But obviously at the end of the day, who actually provides labor is the people themselves, right? So we will for now assume that it's the individuals. Okay. Now, this being said, we'll move forward and we'll first write the definition of labor demand, or you could say labor demand curve, right? So what is labor demand curve? Labor demand curve is a graph. That shows the quantity of labor / people which a company would be willing to hire at different wage rates. Now think about this. Now I'm linking everything with the product market or the product demand, because that way it would be easier for you to understand. Think about this. So what used to be a normal demand curve for any product? So normal demand curve for any product used to that shows us how much quantity would you be willing to buy at different price levels, right? Is this correct? So if I make a normal downward sloping demand curve for any product, let's say coffee. So given the price of coffee, each cup of coffee, how much quantity you will want to demand, right? So if you're operating on this point, this means that perhaps against the price of $10 per cup of coffee, right? So a person would be willing to buy 5 cups on weekly basis. If the price is something less, which means you're operating on point B of the demand curve, then let's say at a price of $8 per cup of coffee, the person is willing to have 7 cups per week and things like that. Just like there's a product demand curve, which shows how much quantity you are willing to buy, at different price levels. Similarly, there's a labor demand curve by the companies that will show how much quantity of labor would a company be willing to hire at different wage rates, right? So depending upon how much compensation you have to pay to a person, right? How much people will this company want to hire? That is your labor demand curve, right? So giving you a simple example. So if the wage rate per day, or let's say, per month or whatever it is, right, is let's say $500 per day, right? So this company might be, let's say this is a construction company, and it's looking for construction workers who can operate the machines, who can operate the cranes and stuff like that, right? So if they're being paid $500 per day or per week, whatever it is, right? So they might be willing to hire 10 people, right? Now, if this wage rate is anything less, right? So let's say 250, right? So they will be willing to hire more people and so on and so forth. But the main question here is, how do we know that the labor demand curve will be downward sloping? Now, this is a quick insight into how the labor demand curve would look like, but we still haven't explained that why the labor demand curve needs to be downward sloping. Are you getting me? Now, to explain this entire process, we will have to go back to the basics that we discussed, right? Now, if you remember in unit 2, we talked about something known as marginal product of labor, right? You remember we talked about this marginal product of labor. Now think about this. Now this is something that you have to understand to know that why is labor. So what's the question that we are addressing over here? Why is labor demand curve downward sloping? That's the question we want to answer. Does it make sense? Right? Demand curve downward sloping, right? So why with higher wages would a firm want to hire less people? Why with, sorry, higher wages? Why with higher wages, a firm would want to hire less people? That's the question that we want to address, right? So to understand this, did you get this, that what we are trying to answer over here? So to answer this question, right. So reducing cost is definitely a concern. Reducing cost is definitely important for a firm, but then also think about the fact that if you hire less people, they will produce less, right? So if you don't want to hire more people, if the wage is going up, but then if you're cutting on your if you're cutting upon your number of employees, then that means less output, and less output means less revenue and stuff like that, right? So you also have to think about the other thing, because think about this. What is labor demand? Labor demand is derived, as we say, and I'll explain you this, right? So labor demand, before this, you should have known that labor demand is derived demand. This is the word that we use for it, which means that the quantity demanded of the final product that labor produces, higher would be demand for labor. Okay, let me explain you what that means. Think about this. So if you take an example of, let's say, a restaurant, right? So even we discussed this example before as well. So if there is a restaurant that has recently opened up and the demand for its food is really, increasing, because the customers really like the food and so on and so forth. Now, what do they need to expand? What do they need to do to expand? Apart from other factors of production, they will also need more labor. They need more people to serve customers in the restaurant. They need more chefs to produce more food in the restaurant, and so on and so forth, right? Is it making sense? Right, Preet? So demand for labor is always derived demand. Similarly, how do schools determine how many teachers to hire? How do online teaching platforms determine how many teachers to hire? That's only based on the idea that how many students you have. So if a school has, if school is getting more number of students, then they will want to have more teachers to accommodate those students. Similarly, if a hospital is getting more patients, then you'll want to have more doctors to look after those patients. Am I making sense, right? So labor demand, no matter what occupation we talk about, no matter what industry we look at, labor demand is always based on how much is the output of the final good. How much is the output of the final good? Is this clear? Any confusion so far? Preet? Are we good on this? Right? Now, this being said, so to answer your question, you were saying that company would want to hire less people if wages are higher, because obviously they want to cut on their costs. That's correct. That's correct. But still, there is more to it. There's still more to it, because less employees also mean less output, which you perhaps might not want to. Right? Okay. Now, what is marginal product of labor? First things first, right? So marginal product of labor is basically the addition in output by hiring one more unit of the addition in output by hiring one more unit of labor. By hiring, so change in output divided by change in labor is your marginal product of labor. Is it simple? Any confusion so far? Right? How do we calculate this? To give you a quick idea, we said, let's say we make different columns over here, right? So you have column 1, which will show you the number of employees you have. Then you have another column that will show you total output, right? So in fact, let's do this calculation because that will help. Okay, so this is this. Then you have another, right? Marginal product. Then you have the price per unit, and then you have total revenue, right? Okay. Okay, have a look at this. So we are about to make a table, and what's the purpose of that? I'll explain you in a bit. Okay, and think about this. So on the first column, I'm writing units of labor. How many units of labor a company is hiring, right? Then, so we are about to extract the labor demand curve. So what exactly is labor demand curve? That is what we're about to look at. But before that, we will have to do some calculations. So you have units of labor uh, on the leftmost column. Then you have total product or total output that will be produced by the firm with different number of labor. Then in the third column, you have marginal product. So marginal product of labor is basically how much additional output is each unit of labor producing, right? That was what marginal product of labor is. Yes or no? So in the third column, you have marginal product of labor, Then in the fourth column, you'll see in a bit why is that important. Price per unit, price per unit, right? And then in the fourth column, you have marginal revenue product of labor. I'll explain you what this is. This might be a new word for you, but I'll explain you when we come to this part. Marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, now shall we get started? Okay, and we can move this to this. Okay, now have a look at this. Breathe. So, and then how about this is first unit, this is second unit, this is third unit, this is fourth unit, this is fourth, then you have fifth, right? Fifth, and then you have sixth. Okay, now think about this. Let's get started on this. Okay. Okay, now when the company hires, have a look at this. So when the company hires first unit of labor, breathe. When the company hires first unit of labor, right? So let's say, and let's take an example of a real business because then it will be easier for us to relate to what is happening in this example, right? So before we even get started, let's take an example. Do you remember in our, when we were talking about the cost and everything, right? We took the example of a restaurant, but let's change that example a little bit. So let's say this is a manufacturing business that manufactures, let's say, footballs, right? A complete unit of footballs, right? Or you can think about a pair of jeans, or you can think about t-shirts or whatever, right? But imagine of any manufacturing business. So let's take the example of t-shirts, right? So if this is a factory that manufactures t-shirts, when you hire the first labor, so obviously that labor would have other resources to produce shirts because you need raw material, you need machines and everything, right? But we're just looking at from labor's point of view. So when you hire the first unit of labor, let's say the total output, so per day, this business used to manufacture 20 t-shirts. Is it making sense? So when I'm filling this out on my own, right? So when you hired the second unit of labor, your total output became 35. When you hired the third labor, your total output increased to 45. When you hired the fourth unit of labor, your total output increased to let's say 50. When you hired the fifth one, right, your total output increased to let's say 53. And when you hired the sixth one, your total output increased to, let's say, 55. Is it making sense, please? Is everything clear so far? Okay. Now, this being said, in the next column, right? So this is the total output. So these two columns will be given to you, right? In case there is an MCQ, right? So after first person, what was the total output? After second person, how much is the total output? After third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. Okay. Now, this being said, let's calculate the marginal product. And can you tell me how much would be the marginal product? So the first guy, when the first guy was hired, your total output increased from 0 to 20. So it would be exactly, so you just need to take the difference. So 35 minus 20 is 15, then it comes 10, right? So you're just taking the difference. So that will show how much is each additional unit of labor producing. This shows us how much each additional unit of labor is producing, right? Yes or no? Absolutely. Now, what product is this labor producing, right? So we have already calculated what marginal product of labor is. So basically what this third column shows is that how much would each specific unit of labor is producing. So the first guy on his own is producing 20 units, the second guy on his own is producing 15, the third 10, and so on and so forth. So that is what marginal product of labor is. As we just saw that how much was the change in total output due to hiring of one more unit of labor. Okay, and this being said, we'll move forward from here. So they are making t-shirts. What product they're making? They're t-shirts, making t-shirts. How much is the price of that t-shirt in the market? How much is the price of that t-shirt in the market? That is what we need to know, right? Now let's assume each t-shirt sells for, I don't know, 500 rupees, right? Or 600 rupees. Now that would be standard for everyone, Preet? That would be the same, right? So if all your employees are making the same type of t-shirts, I'll assume that the price of the t-shirt would stay the same. Yes or no? The price of t-shirt would stay the same. So that's why this column has a standard constant amount, right? Whatever the price this t-shirt sells for in the market, which these these people are producing, that is what I've written over here. Now comes in the final part. Now for the final part where you have to calculate marginal revenue product of labor, right? Now what is marginal product of labor? Marginal revenue product of labor. Now this is a new word that I was telling you. Marginal revenue. So what idea do you get from marginal revenue? That means additional revenue, but this is not just marginal revenue. This is marginal revenue product of labor. Marginal revenue product of labor, which basically means, yeah, I'll let you guess and then I'll see if you are on the right. Exactly. Excellent. So how much will be the change in revenue of the company? So delta revenue due to hiring of one more unit of labor. So that is what your marginal revenue product of labor is. So that is what your marginal revenue product of labor is. That how much will be the change in revenue of the firm due to hiring of one more unit of labor. That is your marginal revenue product of labor. Okay. Now think about this. All you have to do is to multiply these two columns, right? So if the first guy makes 20 t-shirts on his own, and each t-shirt is selling for 500 rupees in the market, then technically this person generated 10,000 worth of revenue for the company, right? It makes 10,000, yeah. Then for the second guy, it would be, how much would 25, 25, 5, 6. So the second guy will be generating a revenue of 7,500 rupees for the company. The third guy would be generating a revenue of 5,000 rupees for the company. Similarly, so on and so forth. You can just multiply the two columns to get these values that I'm listing in this column, right? Easy. Are we good, students? Right? So these are the values of the revenue that these specific employees have generated. So if I compare this column, first column with the fifth column, so it shows that how much revenue did each labor unit contributed. How much revenue did each labor unit contributed? Is this simple? Preet? Are we good? Now we are moving towards the final part of our labor demand curve. Now think about this. What we have to do is to plot these two columns on the graph. And I'll tell you why are we doing this, right? So we have to plot these two values, these two columns on a graph. Just give me a second, right? With that, what will we find? What will we find? That's what I'm about to tell you, right? Okay. Now, have a look at this. So you will plot marginal revenue product of labor and the units of labor on the graph, which we will eventually say that it's your labor demand curve. Have a look at this. So on the y-axis, you will have marginal revenue product of labor for now, right? So the short form of that is marginal revenue product of labor. So that is MRPL, whereas simple marginal product of labor is MPL, right? Because it doesn't include the revenue amount. It's just the physical product that each additional unit of labor is producing. Whereas the marginal revenue product of labor is the additional revenue that each person is generating. And on the x-axis, obviously, you will have units of labor. Now think about this. So when you plot this values on a graph, it will look like a normal down sloping curve like this, right? Now, taking some values here, right? So the first guy was generating a revenue of 10,000 rupees for the firm, right? We did look at, we do know through the calculation that we just did, right? The second guy is generating a revenue of 7,500 rupees, and similarly the third and the fourth and so on, right? This is making sense? Okay, now how is this your labor demand curve? Now I'll explain you how is this your labor demand curve. So this is your labor demand curve because think about this. Why would a company, Preet, now knowing exactly that how much revenue each unit of labor is generating. Now, I hired the first guy, whatever his name was, X, Y, Z, D, A, B, right? Just to give them unique names. So if person X is generating a revenue of 10,000 rupees for the company, would ever a company be interested in paying him something more than this? Think about this. So the labor demand curve, just like our own demand curve, shows our willingness to pay, just like our demand curve. Now, this is not the market price, Preet. When we look at the individual demand curve, it shows how much we are willing to pay, right, for a certain quantity, how much we're willing to pay for a certain quantity. So if the price is this, let's say if in the market the price is this, we'll be willing to pay, we'll be willing to buy 5 units of coffee. If the price of each cup of coffee is $8, then we will be willing to buy 7 cups, right? Are you getting me? How do we know what the price in the market would be for coffee? So the price of each cup of coffee in the market is not based on my demand curve. In fact, that is based on how much is the total demand for coffee in the market and how much is the total supply, like how many cafes or restaurants there are. So where the total market supply of coffee is equals to market demand of coffee, that determines the price of each cup of coffee, which could be 10, which could be 9, which could be $7, anything. Yes or no? Right? So then if the market price, let's say, turns out to be $8, let's say the market price of coffee turns out to be $8, then it means that a person like me with this demand curve, I'll be willing to buy how many cups of coffee? I will be willing to buy 7 cups of coffee per week or whatever. Are you getting me? So similarly, when we are looking at the demand curve, labor demand curve for one firm, when we're looking at the labor demand curve for one firm, that shows how much wages or at certain wage rates, how much quantity of labor would you be willing to hire? How much quantity of labor would a firm be willing to hire at different wage rates, right? So that could not exceed the revenue that each person is generating for the firm. When is your class, Preet? When is your class? So I'm trying to wrap this up. Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. So then we can stretch it a little bit. Okay. Now think about this. So what is labor demand curve? What is labor demand curve? Now think about this. Labor demand curve for one firm is basically its marginal revenue product of labor. Why so? Let me tell you. Marginal revenue product of labor shows marginal revenue product of labor shows revenue that each unit of labor is generating for the company. And obviously economics, like use of basic economics tells us that no firm would be willing to pay or hire a person whose wage rate or wages is higher than what the revenue that person generates. Just think about this. Why are you hiring someone whom you have to pay 50,000 rupees per month, whereas the the revenue, the amount of income that this person will generate for the company is only 40,000? It doesn't make sense, right? So therefore, we know that the demand curve of labor is its marginal revenue product of labor for one firm. But what will be the final wages in the market? What will be the equilibrium wages in the market for a doctor or a dentist or stuff like that? That is something that we'll talk about in a bit, like that we'll talk about in the upcoming classes, right? Are you getting me? So is this absolutely clear, Preet? So just like the price of coffee in a market is not based on how much am I willing to pay. That's to some extent that is because I'm also part of the market. But the price of coffee, the equilibrium price of coffee in the market is based on how much is the demand for that good, how much is the market supply, how much is market demand. Wherever the two intersect, that will be the equilibrium price of coffee in the market, right? So let's say each cup of coffee in Pakistan on average sells for 500 rupees, right? In a typical cafe. Then there corresponding to that is my own demand curve for coffee. So coffee demand curve, or let's put it down like this, Qasim's demand curve for coffee, right? Demand curve for coffee, right? Now, what will that show? Even though it says prices on the y-axis, even though it says prices on the y-axis, but what it's actually showing me is Qasim's willingness, this person's willingness to pay for, right? So if let's say the price is 500, I'll be willing to buy, let's say 2 cups per week, right? So if the price is, let's say 500, each cup of coffee costs us 500 rupees, I'll be willing to buy 2 cups of coffee. If the price of coffee is anything less than this, let's say 400 rupees, I'll be willing to buy more quantity. And similarly, if it's even lower, I'll be willing to buy even larger quantity, and so on and so forth, right? Is it making sense? So now with me knowing that the price, the equilibrium price in the market is 500, so then I know exactly how much quantity I would buy. But if for some reason the equilibrium price drops, if for some reason equilibrium price drops because now there are more cafes have opened up, and so on and so forth, and therefore if the equilibrium price drops from 500 rupees per cup of coffee to 400 rupees per coffee, then how much will I start demanding? I'll start demanding more. I'll start, instead of 2 cups coffee per week, I'll start demanding 3 cups of coffee per week, right? Right. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. So that's the only point I wanted to tell you. So we haven't talked about the equilibrium prices yet, right? Preet? So we haven't talked about the equilibrium prices yet. Equilibrium wages yet. So we have just talked about the demand curve for one firm, demand curve of labor for one firm, right? So in the class that we'll have on Sunday, we'll continue from here, and then you'll get to better understand that how the market demand for labor is determined from individual firms' demand. So this was just for one company, right? So tomorrow, I cannot promise, but I can check, right? I can check and I'll keep you posted, because then Saturday is a holiday for Huda, right? And she says that Sunday is more convenient for her. I can check up and then let you know, right? But we'll coordinate over the message, right? So I'll see you then. Okay. Right. Perfect. Perfect. If that's a possibility, we can definitely do on both days. Okay. So I'll see you then. Take care. Have a good night. Bye.